Okay, welcome everyone. So just telling a note, this is day 3 for me. On Wednesday, we spent the day with PhD students from India, and PhD students here thinking about India with Anant and Namrat and others. I guess all I wanted to say is that the putting together of the LSE Environment Camp, which is a conference focused on PhD students in environment, and the India conference was intentional because we would like to crowd a bunch of people into working on India. And as part of that, we're setting up a hub at the Indian Statistical Institute in the center that SOM directs. The second thing, so it's basically about crowding in the young and getting much more research going on India. But I think the second thing, which is sort of equally important, if not more important, is that the kind of set of challenges that India is facing is common to many other middle and low-income countries. And so what we learn in India, and having worked in India for a very long time, is not just important for India, it's important for the whole world. And that, of course, is made even more apparent by the fact that a lot of the work will be on climate and environment, which is a global issue. So one thing that's interesting is that for many of us who've worked in development, the shift towards climate often came from a focus on poverty. And that focus on poverty has not gone away, but it does feel like this issue is a much more global scope, where India is important both because it's innovative and it's trying out different stuff, but also becoming an important emitter, but also it contains a large population of poor people. And so I think that, getting it right in India is pivotal for the world, not just for India. So we're super excited to be kind of, starting this process of bringing together researchers, policymakers, philanthropists, to kind of think how we can get more work going on in India, and importantly, work that's actually wanted in India. So we're not just about doing research for publication, we're about kind of figuring out what it is that the Indian policymakers, Indian population really wants to know about. And that's why I found in some ways the Wednesday session, where we just sat around a table with, 8 PhD students, particularly revealing, because in those three or 4 hours, we surfaced a whole bunch of potential projects, which looked like A, there was maybe some data, B, maybe there was some interest from some policymakers, and C, the findings might be of relevance to other countries beyond India. So with that, I'd like to pass the mic, I guess, over to Jonathan Leape. Thanks.
Thanks, Robin. And let me add my words of welcome to him as well. I'm Jonathan Leape. I'm the Executive Director of the International Growth Center, and we're very excited to be involved in this new initiative. As Robin says, India is at the front line of the global challenge of sustainable growth, but it's also in the forefront of the global opportunity. That India has a long and very rich tradition of research in development economics and economics more broadly, and has proven to be an intensely fertile ground for developing new ideas about development and new policy solutions and so forth that, as Robin said, very often are able to cross borders. So India feels like a pivotal partner in the global effort to promote and transition to sustainable growth. For us at IGC, it marks the beginning of a new chapter in our relationship with ISI, a relationship that started back in 2008. We set up our first India programs with ISI in 2008-09. And by 5 years later, we had 15 country programs, including 2 in India, but 25% of our global research portfolio was in India. So it's always been a very exciting and a very important part of our research effort. And we see it really as at the center of our current research effort around sustainable growth, and important not just because India is so important in itself, but important also because of the lessons that we will learn for other countries. The country program that we set up back in 2008-09 was led by Suman Berry. And he recognized right at the outset the importance of engaging with policymakers and other stakeholders across the economy and society, and really set in train an approach that has very much become central to IGC's activity and to our ethos. We also, a few years later in 2012, set up Ideas for India, which you may know is a portal for both new research and new ideas around economic policy in India, and really trying to broaden the way in which we and economists generally could engage in policy debates. So it has a very large national audience, Ideas for India, and we very much see it as being part of this new effort based out of ISI. One thing I think that makes it particularly exciting to be building this engagement is that we have both at IGC, but also at LSE more broadly, had very long-term engagement with India. At the highest levels, one of the directors of the school was the former governor of the Reserve Bank of India. Nick, our colleague Nick, who we're delighted to have with us, and Robin have been engaged in India for decades. And I think there's a deep connection both at the level of LSE and at the level of IGC with India, and we're excited to be part of the sort of a new phase, a new chapter in that. And I guess the final thing I want to say is that we very much think about this as collaboration across different dimensions. Very importantly and centrally, collaboration between researchers and policymakers. That if we really want to stimulate better policy discussion and hopefully better policy around sustainable growth, then we need to understand the agenda of those on the policy side and where research can be most useful, and where there are realistic opportunities for reform and where there aren't realistic opportunities for reform. So it's, working closely with policy partners is absolutely essential to eventually making a difference in India, which is our ambition. And we also think, as Robin said, that if we can really engage and develop a thriving interaction, collaboration between a whole range of stakeholders with research at the center, that's going to generate a lot of lessons that we'll be able to carry more broadly. So really delighted to be part of this new collaboration with ISI, and delighted to have Som here with us. But let me first hand over to Anand.
Thanks, Jonathan. Robin started out by saying it's day 3 for him. That actually came up because Robin and I were talking, and one of the things we were discussing is that if you're going to work on India and in partnership with Indian institutions, one of the things that at least personally I felt would be really valuable is to kind of create a community and a network that then grows outward. And so we started on the 4th, tomorrow we have a research session with academics from a whole range of Indian institutions. I hope many of the PhD students and others, also attend that. And then as we were talking about kind of creating this academic network, it sort of also becomes immediately clear that you need a partnership that's broader than just academics. And I think that's how we evolved into today's kind of agenda, which is broader. It pulls together people from philanthropy, from government, and so on. Also disciplines, I came to this from engineering. I know there are people here who are economists now, but were also engineers. And I think in that spirit, work in the environment is at least to me, particularly interesting because you can pull together economists who work on different things. You can pull together people from different disciplines. And I think it very much cuts across the research policy agenda. So I hope this is the start of something that grows and evolves over the next few years. And so with that, I will turn this over to Som.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Robin, Jonathan, Anand, for inviting me and for proposing this partnership. So I hope that lots of good things will come out of it. lots of good research and lots of, and hopefully research that is valuable to people in India and in terms of how it affects their daily lives. And also to people elsewhere, everywhere in the world. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about climate economics from an Indian perspective. And I'll be somewhat selective in the topics that I'm going to cover. So with that, let me begin. Can I have the next slide? Yeah, so I'm going to say a little bit, I'll talk mostly about the first point here on the slide, which is observed climate damages. What I mean is that what we can infer from observing the past. And then I'm going to say just a little bit about one or two aspects of what natural scientists have to say about what's coming from an Indian perspective. And then I'm going to pass very quickly over adaptation and mitigation. For most people, that's passed over everything, right? But that's because you can't cover everything in a short talk. So I'll just make a couple of remarks about each of those topics. They're very important, but I'm not going to say much about them today. You did hear about adaptation if you attended the public lecture yesterday evening. And last, I'm going to say a little bit about solar radiation modification. Not because I've done any research on it, but I'm an interested student. And I think it's understudied. And I think economists need to start taking it much more seriously and learning something about it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of what I've learned about it from natural scientists and engineers. Okay, so yeah, observe climate damage. Next one. Yeah, so I'm going to begin with temperature effects on GDP. Yeah, so obviously the damages that are easiest to measure are those from warming that have already taken place because we've seen what's actually happened. Next point. And so in economics, the studies that have been most frequently used are panel data studies, right? Because you can control for time and place, both. So this is perhaps the most cited paper in climate economics on climate impacts. It's by Burgess and Miguel, and it's now published in 2015. And what they do is they basically fit a quadratic in temperature, looking with GDP growth on the left-hand side, using a long panel of countries. And you can see here that fitting this quadratic, what they see is that it's in the hotter, as you would expect, the hotter countries, you get a negative effect on growth. As you can see, if you look down here, the global distribution of temperature observations, there's more of them on the right. And the global distribution of population has these two peaks, which is in temperate zone, and then in hotter countries where there are a lot of people, including in India and South Asia more generally. But the global distribution of GDP, of course, it's been shifting to the right, but it's still concentrated near the center. And if you look at the point estimate at the average temperature in India, it's about minus 1.7% per degree, meaning that if you get a year which is 1 degree hotter, then you see a 1.7 percentage point decline in GDP growth. Next. Yeah, so this kind of method has been used at more disaggregated spatial scales. So there's a paper the Journal of Environmental Economics and Policy, looking at in a panel of Indian states from 1980 to 2015. And they find a decline in GDP growth of 2.5 percentage points per degree Celsius, which is somewhat higher than what you got from the Burke et al. Global paper. And there's another paper which I didn't mention by Del Jones and Olkan, which was a little earlier than the Berksiang-Miguel paper, and they had a somewhat smaller also effect of temperature. And if what you see at the global level, you also find replicated among Indian states. So at least, well, what you see at the global level in the Del Jones and Olkan paper, not the Burke et al. Paper, but anyway, what you see is that they break up states in India as above median and below median in terms of GDP, and they find a larger effect in poor states. They also find a larger effect for states which are above median share of agricultural output. And then they break up this period into two, and they don't find that the effect is smaller in the second half of the period than compared to the first half. So that's basically figures from the same paper. On the left panel, the blue curve is poor states, that is the below median GDP, and rich states, and you can see that the effect at high temperatures is steeper. It's steeper. Similarly, you see less pronounced between the states which are more dependent on agriculture. And the last panel on the right, that's comparing these two periods, and you can see that there's very little difference in the pre-98 compared to the post-98 period. There's another paper that goes, that disaggregates further, and that's looking using district level data. And they only have a few years, but they find a 3.2% decline in GDP growth per degree Celsius. And again, they see the same thing which the earlier paper found, which is that the effect for poorer districts is larger than for the richer districts. That is the decline in growth per degree Celsius increase. And they don't find, they look at lags also, they don't find lag effects. That is, if you take a 1-year lag, they don't find that to be significant. So, well, there's an earlier literature which looks at effects on crop yields. So there's a large literature in agronomy and the natural sciences on this. But I'm just talking about a few papers by economists, basically using the same kind of panel data methods, but looking at yields of production. And so for India, so rice is the largest crop. And this paper, they find that production is sensitive to monsoon rainfall, as you would expect. If monsoon rainfall is lower, then you get lower production. And it's also sensitive to minimum temperature late in the growing season. So if that's warmer later in the growing season, you get a decline in production. And this paper also looks at aerosols. I'll come back to that. It's important. It's not directly related to climate change, but they find that aerosols. Do I need to say what aerosols are? Well, basically, particulate matter with moisture in the atmosphere, and those are found to adversely affect rainfall. Look at wheat, which is the second largest crop. We find using a panel again that yields fall by about 5% percentage points per degree Celsius, and there's also this aerosol effect, negative effect of aerosols on wheat yields, although the mechanism here is different from the mechanism for rice. For rice, the mechanism is mediated through rainfall. For wheat, it's basically because you get less direct solar radiation in the day. Yeah, so turning to microdata. So this is those were looking at GDP, and this is looking at microdata. So this is a paper with Anand here, and broadly, so this this is data from a nationally representative panel, annual panel of manufacturing plants, and we find that manufacturing output falls by about 2% per degree rise in temperature. We also used microdata from a number of case studies. So this is a picture from one of them. It's a garment manufacturing plant. Next slide. So that's the panel, the top two panels, A and B, garment plants. And what you see here, the data was collected at the daily frequency. So we got the data from the firm that owns these plants. And what you see here is that in plants in which there's no climate control, which is the red lines, you see this dip with maximum temperature in a productivity measure, which the company keeps. And if you look at the plants, which is the gray line in panel A, and the gray line in panel D, you see that if there's climate control, you don't see that dip at high temperatures. And the panel C is a different industry. It's a cloth weaving, some 3 cloth weaving plants in Western India. And you see that kind of dip. So there is some degree of consistency between the aggregate data, GDP, which you can study at different scales. And with here, this is the manufacturing sector, I should say, formal manufacturing, at the micro level, right? And this is at daily frequency. Next. So we can compare this. So this is from the same paper, and this is just to give you a sense of effect sizes at different scales and frequencies. On the left, that's the worker level data from some of those garment plants, the ones without climate control. The second bar is the annual nationally representative panel of plants. The third bar is manufacturing output at the district level. That's also from the same paper, our paper. And the last two are the two papers I mentioned earlier, Dell Jones and Olken, looking at manufacturing in the Dell Jones Olken case, and I think GDP in the BHM case. You can see, that these effect sizes are roughly consistent, even though they're at very different scales and frequencies. But those, when I looked at manufacturing, what we have to keep in mind is that most people in low and lower middle income countries are not working in those kinds of environments. They're working in much harsher environments, and they have much lower earnings typically, like the person in the picture in front. And it's really an overwhelming share of employment in low-income countries, and also lower middle-income countries like India. Next. So this is another study, not yet published, in which my co-author Somanathan Das and I did daily surveys of informal sector workers living in 2 Delhi slums for 1 month in the summer 2 years ago. And I'm just showing you the graph here, which gives you a sense of what the temperature variation was during the period of the study. So the upper one is maximum temperature, and down below the blue line is minimum temperature, and the dotted line is wet bulb temperature which is a measure that incorporates humidity in a nonlinear way, so as to pick up effects of heat on people. Next. And so there's a large diversity of occupations. We had about 400 people in the survey. And there's a large diversity of occupations of people living in these slums, as you can see. Some of them are wage workers, like the construction workers. They will pay daily wages depending on whether you get work or not. And some of them, many of them are self-employed. Next. So if we look at effects of various temperature measures on earnings, you can see the thing that jumps out. So if you look at the red ones, that's total earnings. And on the, it's percentage points, basically, changes in income on the vertical axis. So if you look at the red ones, you can see that the effect for gross earnings. Okay, so let me just say a little bit about what these things are. So we ask people every day, how much, did you go to work? How long did you work? How much money did you make? And so on. So we ask them about total earnings, and we ask them also about work-related expenditure. So if you subtract work-related expenditure from total earnings, you get net earnings, right? And for the self-employed people, there is some work-related expenditure quite often. And so the net earnings is the measure that we actually look at. So that's the blue ones. If you look at net earnings, you can see there's really a shockingly large effect of an additional degree. It's almost 19 percentage points. The other thing that strikes one about this figure, by the way, you see that expenditures, which are the gray ones, don't seem to be affected by heat. The other thing that strikes one is that if you look at maximum temperature, then although there seems to be a negative effect, it's very small and not significant at 5% actually. So if we compare this with the manufacturing sector results, what you can see is that actually these results are large. And now, one thing I should say is that the figure I showed you in the manufacturing sector work, that was maximum temperature, but we also did it with wet bulb temperature. And if you look at the size of the effect with wet bulb temperature, it's much smaller than the effect here. Okay. Now, we should expect that because there are a few things going on here which make this special. Firstly, it's only 1 month in the summer, so it's the hottest time of the year, so you would expect the effects to be largest at that time. And secondly, these people are more vulnerable. They're working mostly outdoors and rather than in indoor environments. And secondly, they're also earning lower incomes, right? They're paid much less on average. So you would expect them to be more vulnerable at home as well, right? So that's basically, it's a combination of these two things. We're looking at them at the worst time of year, and they are also more vulnerable. So it's some combination of those, but it's still striking just how big this effect is. I certainly wasn't expecting anything like that. The other thing that's striking is the fact that there's a much smaller effect of maximum temperature than minimum temperature or wet bulb temperature. And as you'll see in the next few slides, that seems to be the case for other outcomes as well. So this is looking at whether we ask people, did you go to work? If you didn't go to work, why didn't you go to work? And so here we have 3 outcomes here. The red ones are whether somebody did not work, probability of not working, and the other 2 are conditional or not working. So there was quite a lot of people who didn't, there were a large number of people who didn't work on many days. So on average, 17% of the time, somebody did not go to work. And of those, more than half the time, and they didn't go to work, they said it was because of heat. And it doesn't seem to be the case if you look at the the gray ones, that the reason expressed for not going to work, being that work not available, didn't seem to be affected by any of the temperature measures. But as you can see, there is an effect of temperature. It raises the probability that people don't go to work. And the reason that they don't go to work being due to heat is, as you would expect, affected by whether it's hot or not. Right. So obviously part of the reason for this earnings decline with temperature is because people are not going to work. So this is there's some evidence, it's not conclusive, but it's suggestive that a good deal of what's happening here, the reason people are not going to work isn't because of the demand side. It's not because they don't expect to find work. It's because it's too hot. So that's suggestive that it's on the supply side. Next one. Okay. Here we also asked them about whether any member of the family was sick, whether they visited a doctor, whether they slept well, whether they went to work. And you can see that, hotter days, it's more likely, at least for 3 measures, minimum, mean, and wet bulb temperature, that somebody was more likely to be sick if those measures were higher. Visiting a doctor there doesn't seem to be much of an effect in any of these measures except maximum temperature. You can see that the minimum temperature and wet bulb temperature, if it's higher, then they're less likely to report that they slept well. And they're less likely to report, they're more likely to report that they did not go to work, which I had mentioned earlier. Next. And this is on number of hours slept. And again, you can see, as you might expect, that minimum temperature, wet bulb temperature, there's a big effect on people reporting how long they slept. And that's less associated with maximum temperature. And we also asked them about spending money on medical expenditure. And here you can see that it's positively associated. So it's probably expenditure on medicines, because it didn't seem to be more likely that they went and saw a doctor. Okay. And we also asked an open-ended question about other expenditures which were not work-related. And one of the things that was mentioned quite frequently, so we quoted it, was that they bought ice, or they bought water, or ice and water. And that seems to be obviously to cope with the heat. And you can see that, as expected, that's increasing in these temperature measures, but again, not in maximum temperatures. That it seems as if these measures, minimum and wet bulb temperature, are better predictors of many of these things than maximum temperature. Next. So, this is a survey that was done at one end of the global temperature distribution, right? It's Delhi in the summer, at the hottest time of the year. So it's kind of extreme, but so you might think that, it's kind of way out there, not that many people affected. But in fact, there's a lot of people. There's a large number of people who are exposed to temperatures like this for at least 1 month a year. So it is at one extreme, but it's not as if it's negligible by any means. Next. Well, before I go to that, let me just say one more thing, which is there's an implication here, something which we didn't expect when we did the study, which is the fact that we don't see anything much going on with maximum temperature, but we see quite a lot going on with minimum temperature, wet bulb temperature, has an implication if it holds up, if this is replicated and it holds up, it has an important implication for adaptation, right? Because if you think about how you protect people, you can think about protecting them during the day when they're at work, and that's what one tends to think of kind of naturally. You think, well, people are working outdoors during the day, it's hot during the day, they're exposed, and so we should find ways to protect them. But it seems as if it's important that people are protected at night. Because if the minimum temperature is high and people don't sleep well, then presumably there's fatigue, illness, and so on. And a lot of these effects appear to be operating through that channel. So this is kind of it's used sort of just an illustration of how it's useful to have micro level studies, because it gives you information about what might work better for adaptation than macro stuff can do. Okay, so rainfall. Of course, rainfall is obviously hugely important for agriculture, and it's likely to interact with temperature. I mentioned rainfall earlier because when we looked at if you look at the rice thing, it's clear that droughts have a very bad effect. Next one. But rainfall, fortunately for India, rainfall is still important, but it's not as important as it used to be. So rainfall shocks are not as damaging as they used to be. So there's a paper here that uses a drought index that involves, I don't know whether Digvijay is here. It's one of the authors of this paper, but yeah, there you are. Okay. So, so this paper uses a drought index that involves the product of rainfall and temperature deviations. And they find that Indian summer rice yield has become much less vulnerable to droughts over time. But that doesn't mean that the effect has gone away. It was still there, at least at the period, at the time, towards the end of this period of study. Next. Okay. So how am I doing for time? So that's what I want to say about observed data and what we can learn. I mean, there's a lot more stuff, right? But I'm just giving you a sense of some of the things that are important. I want to say just a couple of things about some impacts which the natural scientists have talked about. There are others, so I'm not covering everything. This isn't comprehensive. Okay. So this is looking at glaciers in the mountains in South and Central Asia. If you look at the ones affecting India, this panel West, Central, and East Himalaya. And what you can see is that what they're predicting is a lot of glacier mass loss, right? And there is a big difference between different scenarios. So the red ones are RCP 8.5, and the blue dotted line is RCP 2 point something. That's the most favorable one with the least warming. And you can see there is a big difference. But you see, even with the most favorable scenario, you're going to have quite a lot of glacier mass loss, at least as estimated by the cryology, the people who study glaciers. Next. And this paper looks at the effect of glacier and snowpack loss on agriculture. And what these maps show you is the yield of different crops here: wheat top left, rice top right, cotton, and sugarcane. And this is the portion of the yield that they attribute to water from glacier and snowmelt. So there's the other major source of water is, of course, rainfall and groundwater irrigation. Okay, so those are the other two sources. And what you can see is basically, so these, in case you can't recognize what these maps are, you can see the Indian coastline towards the bottom. Basically, the polygon on the left is the Indus Basin. Polygon in the center is the Ganges Basin. The polygon on the right is the Brahmaputra Basin. Right. So basically, there's more rainfall, monsoon rainfall in the east, and there's less and less as you go west. So as you see in the Indus Basin, which is on the western side, it's much more dependent on glacier and snowmelt, all of these crops. And then it's basically the Brahmaputra basin, they're not dependent on any of these crops. They're not dependent on glacier and snowmelt. And the Ganges basin is somewhere in between where where glacier and snowmelt is quite significant for sugarcane in Uttar Pradesh. Okay, and to a lesser extent in some of these, in Punjab and Haryana, some of the other crops, wheat, rice as well. And the significance of this is because, well, we are going to lose a lot. We have already lost a lot of glacier mass, and we're also losing snowpack. Okay, next. So the other one that is kind of important and quite grim is sea level rise. So these are projections. So this map, the red areas show land projected to be below tide line in 2030. And as you can see, there are huge areas in Eastern India and Bangladesh, which are likely to have saline intrusion very, very soon. Right? Some of these areas are already affected, but the area affected is predicted to expand a lot. I don't know, this is not my field, so I don't know how reliable these projections are, but this is what's out there in the published literature. Next one. This map, the red areas expand a lot if you look at areas which are going to be flooded by seawater once a year, projected to be flooded once a year. It's really huge. And just the next one, that zeroes in on Kolkata, which is the capital of West Bengal. It's a large population, and you can see the areas all around the city are, projected to be flooded on average once a year, very soon. Right. So I think these are sort of predictions which when I saw them, I thought, well, why isn't there more concern about this? But I don't know. I don't know how reliable it is, but that's what's out there in the published literature, as I said. Next. Okay, so adaptation is going to be full of holes. I think that's the main thing I want to say. We should do as much of it as we can, but it is going to be full of holes because, there are so many different impacts. They're so heterogeneous. They affect people in so many different ways that it's very hard, even with, very good coordination and planning, to be able to deal with all of it. So I think the first order thing is that growth is essential. People are very vulnerable because they're poor. We saw that in the informal sector workers. If they were less poor, they would be much less vulnerable. And so that's simple. Next one, we need spatially disaggregated forecasts because of the heterogeneity. Next. And we need an understanding of the mechanisms of the impacts, because that's really crucial for figuring out what's an appropriate adaptation and policy and what isn't. So that's all I have to say about adaptation. On mitigation, the political reality is that it's seen as expensive and it's not a political priority because there's lots of things on the agenda, right? And basically, growth and so on is obviously the first priority. And the general feeling is, why should one of the poorest countries in the world finance the global public good? So in this context, it's best to look for existing distortions as removal can improve mitigation. And there are plenty of those, right? Next. So one of them is electricity system reform. It's an obvious place to look. One of the things that I found in a paper a few years ago is that domestic pollution externalities are actually large compared to climate externalities. If you account for them, then there's a lot of incentive for the government of India from a purely Indian, narrowly selfish Indian perspective to do a lot of mitigation. But of course, it's easy to say that, but then addressing domestic externalities is not easy. But nevertheless, that's an area a lot of people are working on, and it's important. So that's all I'm going to say about mitigation. Now I want to spend 5 minutes introducing you. As some of you will probably already know about this, but it's something that's less studied, is solar radiation modification. So it was suggested by Paul Crutzen in 2006. He was a chemistry Nobel laureate who was one of the discoverers of the ozone hole. And basically, what is it? It's basically the idea that you inject sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere, which is the atmospheric layer above the one that we live in. When it starts at 20 kilometers altitude. And the reason that you want to inject these aerosols is to basically reflect sunlight to cool the earth. That's the idea. You want to put it in the upper atmosphere, not in the lower atmosphere, because if you put them in the lower atmosphere, they settle within days. Put them in the upper atmosphere, it lasts more than a year. So you have to do much less of it. It's much cheaper. We know that it works because we've seen it in volcanic eruptions. Interesting thing is that from a global perspective, it's very cheap, right? It really will not cost much to do it. However, it can only be done by large countries with aerospace capability because it requires building a fleet of large cargo planes that can reach 20 kilometers altitude. Such planes do not currently exist. There's been no reason to build them. So we have spy planes which go that high, and we have big cargo planes which fly low, right? But we don't have big planes that can take thousands of tons of sulfur dioxide or sulfuric acid and release it high up. But it can be done, and there are people who are at least thinking about the concept of how to engineer such planes. Yeah. So let's just think about a little bit about the economics. If we think that, if we believe these estimates about, those from the panel data estimates, let's say maybe 3% decline for a degree of warming, that amounts to $90 billion annually. If you go to the US, you find a much smaller effect, and that translates to about $75 billion. So next. So looking at those orders of magnitude, we're talking about something which is of the order of, 0.5% or 1% of global GDP per degree of warming. And that's about the order of $1 trillion, right? So these things are completely different orders of magnitude. So if that's all there was to it, next. If that's all there was to it, then clearly SRM is wonderful, but obviously, SRM has risks. You're going to be doing something which is going to cool the earth. It changes the global climate. There are model risks which include ozone loss and uneven drying and wetting. The ozone loss problem is quantitatively small, so it's not really an important risk. Next. So one thing is that the world has got wetter as a result of warming, and it's projected to get more wetter, right, with more extremes. But if you reverse some of this warming, what you'll get is the world won't get as wet as it would otherwise have got, right? But you're also changing the climate system. So it's not the equivalent of not putting the carbon dioxide in to begin with. And you could have more drying. You could have, overcompensation, so to speak, in terms of rainfall in some areas. And that's probably the biggest risk that people are worried about. Next. However, current climate models suggest that that's not likely, provided aerosols are injected evenly in both northern and southern hemispheres. So it's very different from observing the natural experiments that we saw, which are uncontrolled, and engineering this. Next. So something about the politics. There's been strong resistance to SRM, to even talk about SRM, or to do research on SRM from environmental groups in Europe and North America. And probably because, in my view, it's because the adverse consequences of warming still seem to be in the future, right? Unlike what they are if you live in Delhi, they're not in the future, they've arrived. Next. And one of the fears expressed by such groups is that if you did this and you cooled the earth a little bit, then there would be less of an incentive to do mitigation, which you have to do anyway, right? Because this is not a solution to the problem. All it does is it temporarily, it's like an adaptation at a global scale. It just temporarily protects you. And it's been suggested by Marty Weitzman initially that SRM has a free driver problem as opposed to a free rider problem. And what he means by that is that because it's so cheap to do, it's conceivable that it could be done unilaterally by a single country, which might be bad for other countries. Next. So there's been quite a bit of theoretical work on this. This is just one paper. And what they show in their model here is that, so you might think that, okay, if a country unilaterally deploys SRM, that might give incentives to other countries not to mitigate because the earth is cooler, so you don't need to spend a lot of money mitigating. But on the other hand, if countries have heterogeneous perceptions about riskiness and cost-benefit analyses of SRM, then it can have the opposite effect as well, in the sense that some countries decide, okay, we'll mitigate more so as to not give other countries an incentive to do the SRM, which these countries perceive as too risky. Next. So the last thing I want to say is I think that SRM is important, that it may be needed. It depends. Much more research has to be done on the risks. And I think that some of that research should be done by economists. In particular, what we need to do is to understand better, how changes in temperature and rainfall patterns would translate to economic losses. So I'll stop there.
I think we're now going to enter Q&A. We haven't received any questions in the chat, but if there are any in the room, I encourage you all to answer those. Ask those, please. When you have your question, if you could just press and hold your microphone on your desk, briefly introduce yourself, your name and organization.
In the front row, they're not working. That's all right.
I was wondering, I've read a little bit about the idea that we are globally trying to reduce SO2 emissions, including from shipping fleets, which are a large producer of them, but also countries like India. And this, is it correct to say that this might, in fact, exacerbate warming because the sulfur dioxide that we treat as a pollutant is in part playing the role of SRM that you noted, even though it's emitted at lower heights?
Yes, in fact, when Cropson wrote that editorial in Climatic Change, he was motivated partly by that, because he said that, well, if we do all this mitigation, then we're going to be reducing sulfur dioxide emissions because we're going to be burning a lot less coal. And if we reduce sulfur dioxide emissions, then we will be removing some of the masking effect that this pollution has on warming. So the earth is going to start warming faster. And he suggested that, well, if we can't do enough mitigation fast enough, then already by 2006, he thought that that wasn't going to happen in time to prevent a lot of serious damage. And so, that's why he suggested that, well, we could inject these pollutants in much smaller quantities in the upper atmosphere and to sort of act as a bit of a shield.
Oh, thank you very much, Som. I had one or two observations. I've never really understood why comparing Madrid and Stockholm or Tamil Nadu and Himachal tells us anything very much about climate change. The move from 1 or 1.5 degrees to 3 degrees transforms the whole world's climate. You can't really pick it up by these cross-section or even modified cross-section analyses. And at 3 degrees, which we saw last 3 million years ago, Homo sapiens has been here about 300,000, let alone 3 million years. Just to take one key variable, sea levels were 10 to 20 meters higher than now. Well, we're sitting here about 10 meters above sea level. New York's about 10 meters above sea level. Cambridge is about 6 meters above sea level. It's just an example of whole areas would become uninhabitable, and very large numbers of people, probably hundreds of millions, perhaps billions, would have to move at 3 degrees. You simply don't pick that up by these cross-section comparisons. They tell us very little, really, about the effects of climate change. I mean, I thought that the stuff about how people work in different temperatures is a much higher order of interest. It tells us much more about what could happen than those cross-section comparisons, which I think are really just diversionary. Why would India want to act? Well, a number of reasons. The clean is cheaper than the dirty across a whole range, probably about a third of the world's emissions. And the clean will be cheaper than the dirty, probably across about 70% of the world's emissions, maybe 10 years from now. So that's without tax or subsidy. Now there's lots of investment to do, but it's high returns investment. So, and that doesn't take into account the problems of domestic air pollution, of course, which, as you argued, surely rightly, are very severe. The second reason why India would want to act is that it's a very powerful determinant of what other people do. And in a world where you're negotiating, discussing, if India were to step backwards, I don't think it will, of course, but if it were to step backwards, that'd have a very profound effect. So it's not just one country on its own. That's true for many countries, but particularly for India. And third, India takes its role in the world seriously. So there are 3 very powerful reasons for India acting on that. Lastly, on SRM, there is already quite a lot of work, as you know, on the effects. And it can have some very powerful effects on shifting weather patterns. So, for example, it could shift very sharply the rainfall patterns, particularly in tropical areas. So Nigeria, which is already suffering from the creeping advance of the Sahara, could actually be very powerfully affected. There are effects through the acidification of oceans, which could be very powerful and which we really don't understand, which could be enormous, but we simply don't know them. So it would be incredibly risky to do something like that. I think much more interesting is carbon dioxide removal, which depends how you do it, but even the very expensive stuff which just pulls it out of the air is already around $500 a ton, and it could get down to $100 a ton maybe in 10 years or so. And that's a much less risky way of doing it. And a cap of $100 a ton on carbon prices would actually be reasonably cheap, because we could certainly get emissions down to 10, 15 gigatons probably by 2050 with all these new ways of doing things, which are much more productive. So if we were left with 10 or 15 gigatons at $100 a ton, that's $1.5 trillion a year, which are the GDP of, by then, probably 150 if we'd been good about climate. 150 trillion would be cheap at the price. So we should have tried to understand the SRM and its risks, but the more we learn, the more risky it seems to be. Let's do more work and we'll probably find out it's still more risky. But CDR, it seems to be carbon dioxide removal, even with the direct measures that I'm talking about, That's putting aside, what you can get through forests or biochar or algae and so on. It seems to be a much more promising and less risky way of doing it. But of course, the better we do on the mitigation, the less we have to do on those other things.
So let me just respond to a couple of those things. I agree with most of what you said. I do think there's some value in the cross country or cross state or cross district work, because it's, well, firstly, it's not really cross-sectional comparisons, really, because it's a panel, they're all panels, so you're looking at, comparing essentially the same district in different years when it's hotter and when it's not so hot. And so I think the value of that is to point out that we already have lost quite a lot, right? It's exactly the same kind of work that we are doing with, it's the same thing. It's the same methods used for estimating effects on yields that have already happened. So I completely agree with you that, a world which is a degree warmer than it is today would be a very, very different world. And you have all kinds of effects that you're not going to see. So I take your point, but I think the value of what this stuff that has been done is it shows you that we have already incurred these losses. We're incurring them as we speak. And they're large. So I showed you those numbers. Those losses are large. They're of the order of percentage points of world income. On the SRM, I think that more research is absolutely needed, and that there are these risks. I think the point is that there's a very big what I see in the discourse is that there's an asymmetry in the way people take the risks of SRM and the risks of continuing on our present path. If we continue on our present path, the global temperature is going to rise for another 50 years. There's no way that with all the mitigation and the best will in the world and the best political outcomes and so on, we're going to get to the point where the temperature stops increasing in anything less than half a century. If you look at the impacts that people are already suffering, right, in the poor countries in the world, you're basically asking a whole lifetime of people to suffer, right? The CDR, I think it's absolutely going to be necessary. It's going to be necessary because in the best case, it's going to take 50 years to get to net zero. And then the temperature is going to be unacceptably high. So you want to have to take the carbon dioxide out. So we're going to need the CDR. And the sooner we start figuring out how to bring the cost down, the better. But it's going to take a long time. If you spend 1% of world GDP on it every year, you'll maybe take out 10 billion tons a year, right? And you need to take out 1 trillion tons to get back down to levels that don't inflict the kinds of damages that we've already seen in the data. So I think that that's the perspective that I have. I think if you come from Delhi, then you see the risks of proceeding without doing SRM as being unacceptably high, right? SRM is extremely risky, but I think, and we need a lot more research to try to figure out a way to make it safe. Because if we can't make it safe, then we're looking at 50 years of, more than 50 years, basically hundreds of years before we can get the temperature back down of, very, very high damages. So that's my perspective.
Thank you for that. Just a quick question. What are your thoughts on the moral hazard argument that the resources and research and everything will go towards this solution, even though politically it's probably going to be unviable because, as you said yourself, the risks seem to be very, very high?
Well, I mean, the point is that right now, I think the risks of doing nothing, right? Because we know that the world is warming and, for example, we're already at the stage where another half a degree or less, and you've lost all the world's coral reefs. That half a degree cannot be stopped by mitigation. It cannot be stopped by CDR. The only way it could be put off and I only say put off, is by doing SRM. So my point is that there are risks of not doing anything. There are also risks of doing SRM. I think the way to deal with that is to do as much research on SRM, to do it urgently, and to discuss it, because the governance problems with SRM are very, very serious. It's hard, right? But do we want to find ourselves a decade from now in a situation where some large country has reached the point where it says, well, we cannot continue, we have to do SRM? Do we want to be there in a decade without having done the research and without knowing, how unsafe it is, or if it is not so unsafe, if it's reasonably safe, how to do it in a way that doesn't cause damage, and how to put governance structures in place so that when it's done in a way that protects everybody as far as possible. So what I worry about is a situation 10 or 15 years from now where, this will happen in a chaotic, unplanned, unresearched way, rather than a way in which there has been a lot of discussion, debate, negotiation, and all of that.
David Keith was here last environment week, and we spent a few hours with him talking about he's one of the global experts.
Clearly, there's people in the world who are meeting in New York and elsewhere, including ex-leaders, talking about this. So I guess the question to you, because there's a lot of PhD students in the room, is on both those fronts, the SRM front and the carbon capture front, is there places that economists can actually, like PhD students, could actually, you say a lot more research, but what is the type of research that, I mean, maybe it's not in economics, but how do we do that? Because what he was saying is you could go up and release some of this stuff, right, and study it. And that's been done multiple times because it's been a technology that's been around for a long time. But when we say more research, what do we mean to figure out whether it would work, whether it would be safe? That's the bit I don't know how to proceed, basically.
Yeah, I think that what I meant to say in that last slide was, I think we need to do a lot more studies of what the economic effects would be of changes in rainfall patterns, precipitation, because temperature and precipitation together, because if we go ahead without doing SRM, we're going to get more rainfall and higher temperatures. We know the higher temperatures are extremely damaging. We know that higher rainfall is not damaging per se, but the reason it's damaging is because the distribution is expected to shift and become more extreme. It already has, and that's going to get worse. But what we don't know is what would be the effect if you did SRM. You get a smaller temperature increase, but you get probably some drying somewhere, right? So we need to understand much better what are the effects of drying in different places if that were to happen. And I think that's where looking at damages from that is part of the research that economists could do.
Yeah, so we're nowhere near ready for that. I mean, we need our science friends to tell us much more about SRM. I think that's clear, and most of us would agree on that. But the current knowledge and understanding from the science of what could be involved, and there is already quite a lot of work, is still very open-ended. I mean, it may be that it would shift the the tropical pattern of rainfall south and make a lot of Nigeria a desert, but we don't know that, and it's even very hard to put serious probabilities on that. The sulfur dioxide and the CO2 that it would generate will probably play havoc with the oceans, with very powerful effects. But it's very hard to do the economics. But my point here is that it's very hard to do the economics of all that without a lot more help from our science friends. So my instincts at the moment would be encourage our science friends to help us understand it better. But there's a much bigger story here, which is that if we invest in the growth story of the 21st century, which is, very powerful decarbonizations, exploit the increasing returns to scale, get the health effects, take advantage of the very rapid falling in cost of the low carbon activities. We have a very attractive way of going forward, which we could pursue pretty quickly. And it's there where it seems to me most of the economics research would be alongside adaptation. I did try and set that out in my Lionel Robbins lectures in March, which some of you will see, but there's a huge research agenda there, which is already very tractable. And I don't yet think there's enough science for us to get our hands around SRM, but we should encourage our science friends to push it as hard as we can so that that knowledge builds.
Just one, we've already discussed your main point, but the amount of sulfur dioxide you have to inject is very small compared to the amount of sulfur dioxide we're already injecting at lower levels.
CO2, you leave the CO2. You leave this, the sulfur's up there, but you leave the CO2, and that can have that will go on rising and have a potentially very powerful effect on the ocean.
I have nowhere ever meant to imply that this is a substitute. It's not. It's very, very cheap to do, but you have to continue doing the mitigation. Otherwise, you're putting yourself in an extremely dangerous situation. It's like you're building an embankment on a river, right, to protect people from a flood. But then when you've done that, the riverbed keeps rising because the silt is inside, right? This is happening in many Indian rivers. And SRM is like that. You build this sort of shield, correct? But you're in a much more fragile situation because if you take the shield away, you're going to be exposed all at once to a very big thing. So there's no way this is a substitute. It's not. But it's just meant to mitigate damage in the meantime. That's all.
Just conscious of time, so if I think, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, can I wait up in the?
If that works, yeah.
Yes, it works. Hi, my name is Sophie Bellini. I'm a PhD candidate on
Hi, my name is Sophie Bedini. I'm a PhD candidate in environmental economics at the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands. And actually, my supervisor did quite a lot of work on geoengineering. So her name is Anna Battaglio, and she published quite a lot of papers actually with Alessandro Tavoni and other people at the University of Bologna. I think they have some publication quite recent on PNAS. And actually, they're showing that an important problem in SRM is actually governance. So the problem is that usually you would expect deployment not in a unilateral setting, but in a multilateral setting, precisely because the technology is so cheap. And then what happened is that this is still a technology that people can't control very well because locally it works in a way, but then because of the climate system, it's probably going to have different effects elsewhere. And this actually introduces a big coordination problem because then agents don't understand what to expect from other people because they can't understand what is intentional, what is not intentional. And this can end up in some form of engineering war, even if there are no aggressive kind of intention from any side, just because people are trying to anticipate what others will do. And this can end up in excessive cooling, for instance. So I would say that in terms of what we can do as economists, there's a lot of work to do on governance, because even before refining a technology, you need to figure out a way in which the technology can be deployed in a safe way. And if that's impossible, and I think economists can contribute to this question because we know how incentives works and how coordination can be facilitated. So I guess that's the first step, to figure out whether a technology can be useful. And then of course we should partner up with other scientists which are actually studying the technology in itself. But I would say that there's a big role for economists in this sense, because the main uncertainty is actually driven by governance. So,
yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think that's research that is being done by economists, and yeah, we do need more of that. Very much.
Does this work? Yeah. Hi, my name is Meenal Pathak, and I teach at Ahmedabad University in India, and agree with the comments on SRM. And as someone who's followed the science in the IPCC, I think we need to understand what SRM brings in the future, but also from a governance, but also an equity perspective. So there I agree. But I would be cautious in zeroing in on one of the geoengineering technologies. I would put it alongside the whole range of options, including CDR, and then see and study them all. I would not necessarily say SRM should be the focus of study, but that's my view, and my research does not focus on SRM. My second comment is on whether India can act or not. So yes, India obviously can act, and we do have a net zero target. And also we've been raising ambition on renewable energy, but I think the pace that you might need to meet the global 1.5 ambition, that would have trade-offs with immediate growth and development concerns. And that's really the challenge that India faces. But I'll be presenting a little bit on that tomorrow.
Yeah, I sort of agree with everything you said. I guess I should just say that I think we're going to need a lot of CDR, but it's a long-term thing, right? And with SRM, you can get you can do something in the meantime. That's all. It's short-term, relatively.
We have time for one or two more questions on the back there. Yeah.
I'm Radhi Radhana, and I'm based at IIT. So I just wanted to ask you about your assessment. I just wanted to ask you about your assessment of the IPCC's projection that in the latter half of the century, the temperature will rise beyond 1.5, and then we have to rely on CDR to reduce emissions and consequently temperature. Do we have any evidence of the fact that a reduction in CO2 emissions will actually reduce temperature? And how reliable is this sort of pathway going forward?
You mean a reduction in the concentration?
Yeah. So the limited overshoot that is, we're relying on in the latter half of the century.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure I quite understand your question. I think it's very well established that if you reduce the CO2 concentration, then the temperature will fall. Right. I think the difficulty is reducing the CO2 concentration. It's just going up and up. And yeah, in the best case, we can get to the point where it stops going up in maybe 50 years. And after that, it can come down, right? I mean, I have really no interest in the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. It's just completely political. It's totally arbitrary. Every increase in temperature is causing damage, right? And all the damage, we've already had a lot of damage. I think that was one of the things I wanted to get across in this talk. So any increase from today is more damage, right? So yeah, I think we need to do as much mitigation as we can. We need to do, we'll have to do CDR. It's just going to take a very long time.
We'll get squeeze one more in. We're a little bit over time, but then we'll answer.
Hi, my name is Bala Srinivasan, University of Chicago and Ahmedabad University. I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned big countries doing unilateral stuff on SRM. And this is just ignorance, have India or China at the government level ever said anything about SRM?
Not that I'm aware of. There's a little bit of SRM research that's funded by the Department of Science and Technology in India. It's just modeling work. In the US, most of the SRM research is being done in the US. It's funded, a lot of it is funded by private philanthropy because it's seen to be politically sensitive. So although some of it is funded as part of climate science funding by the NSF and NOAA and others. But from a policy perspective, no, people are not talking about it. And I think that's a mistake. I think people need to start talking about it because we might get to the point where you're trying to do things in a rush.
Okay, I think unfortunately we're going to have to call it there, but thank you very much, Professor Somanathan. So So for everyone in the room, we'd like to invite you to tea and coffees just outside. We'll have about 10 minutes for tea and coffees, and then we'll be back in here for the next section. Yeah, so Michael. Grab a cup and you pick one, just pour water if you want to, just hold on to that when you come up.
Can you have an order for us here? I welcome David. I've never seen anything the best about it.
All right. Hi, everybody. We will get started with the next session. So this session is really all about catalyzing the ecosystem for research and policymaking in India. And I think I'll start by first remarking that sustainable growth is a...
Oh, stop it. Stop it.
So I'll... We're sorry. So I'll say that this is a big challenge and we have a big panel to discuss today. And to pick off maybe from where Som kind of touched on his master lecture, we know that India has a growth imperative, and the way that India chooses to grow or how it will grow will not only affect its own environment, but also the environment of the world. And in that sense, we really do want to think about sustainable growth for India. You could argue that because of many innovations, technological or institutional, that there's a big opportunity for sustainable growth now in India. But realizing this opportunity is going to require a lot of research, especially research into what policies are effective, how they operate in the economy, and how they affect many, many different aspects of society. And so in that sense, the goal of today's panel is to really think about how we can create such a vibrant ecosystem for researchers and policymakers to work together. So the structure of the session will be the following. So I will first have a few high-level questions, I suppose, for Robin, Jonathan, and Som to just reflect on their experiences on kind of 3 questions, which I'll lay out. And then after that, I'll turn one by one to, I don't want to say case studies, but more specific examples that Bala, Shweta, and Michael online have been working on with respect to India as well. So I think most of our panelists have been introduced at various points throughout this week. Certainly Robin, Jonathan, and Som have been introduced. So Bala Srinivasan is joining us from the University of Chicago and Ahmedabad University. He'll tell us a lot more about the work and the initiatives he has. Shweta Banerjee is from BRAC, India, and is leading a lot of excellent initiatives there. And Michael Greenstone is joining us, sadly remotely, but I'm sure he would have loved to be here. He's joining us from the University of Chicago, where he's, among many other things, also running EPIC as well. So I'll start off with 3 high-level questions, and I think maybe Jonathan can first reflect, and then I'll have Som talk about his experience in India, and then maybe Robin can wrap up. But to kickstart the conversation, I had three questions for you to ponder. Number one, how do these ecosystems of research, or between policymakers and researchers, how can that help the pursuit of sustainable growth? Number two, what should these ecosystems look like? So ecosystems is a fun term, but practically, what do we need to be seeing on the ground in terms of the interfacing between policy makers and researchers in India? And third, what can we learn from past experiences in India, but perhaps also elsewhere? Perhaps, Jonathan, you can talk a lot about IGC's co-generation approach here. So I'll have you kick off, Jonathan. Feel free to talk for 5 minutes or so. And then I'll turn to you, Som, to think about your perspectives from India as well. So, Jonathan.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Quite big questions. Starting with the first one, how can ecosystems help promote sustainable growth? I think to sit back and expect that if academic researchers or any researchers just produce some great ideas and they will find their way into policy and have a great impact is something that we know now is demonstrably untrue. That in order to bring research into policy effectively and to help to create a situation where research is informing real decisions, real policy decisions, quite a bit has to happen. Partly that's because there are some forces that drive the two apart. The timescales of policymaking are typically quite different from the timescales of research. The language of policy is quite different from the language of research, and then the narratives around policy can be very different from the narratives around research. The personalities involved in the two could be very different. So there are lots of things that prevent it from happening naturally. And so I think one of the things that IGC has been sort of reflecting on and evolving its model in response to over the past 15 years is what does it take to make that work? So to start with your first question, what's the payoff to that? The payoff is connecting research more effectively to policy. And I'll talk a bit about that, the different stages of that in a minute, in a way that really generates better outcomes for beneficiaries and generates policy in particular, perhaps that has better long-term effects than might otherwise be the case. So I think the prize is that when we get these sort of interactions and collaborations and even co-generation, as we like to refer to it, to work, then the payoff really is in better policy outcomes and in very, very tangible ways. And one of the things IGC spends a lot of time doing is trying to understand and track our impact. And so we look at those sort of outcomes and so forth quite seriously. So just in terms of how do they help us? I think they really help connect research to policy in a way that just isn't going to happen naturally. And so there's a role for the sort of intentional ecosystem. What do ecosystems look like? Well, let me mush this up a little bit with the last question, which is what can we learn from past experiences? I think for ecosystems to work effectively, lots of people have to be interacting. So crucially, different stakeholders have to be interacting. And researchers are part of that and policymakers are part, but then there are other stakeholders outside of the research and policy sphere. So ecosystems have to be environments in which this interaction works. Well, if we want that to work and it's not working currently, then clearly we have to do something differently. So we have to think, what is it that can change that? And I think what we try to do is think about all the different margins. So what is it that prevents the policymaker from being engaged? What is it that prevents the researcher from being engaged? What is it and to think about both the incentives that these actors are facing and the constraints and so forth. So let me start with some extent the easier part, or maybe the sort of more common part, and that is, what is it that prevents researchers from engaging in issues that the product of which, the research about which can be really useful for policy? Well, one of the things I think is access to data. That data, there can be quite a big fixed cost in terms of starting to do research in an area of a particular area of policy relevance. And so it can just be too daunting to access the research, to clean the data, whatever, or the data might not be available, might be confidential, or it might be this government hasn't got around to making it available. So data is a big thing, and in fact, Katya, who's probably here, has been doing a lot of amazing work in India now to try to build a data lab, working with Niti Aayog and work that we're funding. And the idea there is to really make some of the key data sets, micro data sets, accessible and usable for researchers. So we think that's a key thing, is thinking about the data, and that's can address one of the constraints on researchers. Another is sort of understanding of the context, and depending on what the research is on, that can mean different things: social, political, economic, policy context. In this area that we're talking about, the policy context is particularly important, because impact is not the result of just the quality of the idea or the quality of the evidence, but also the extent to which there's a window of opportunity for change. And the extent to which there's a window of opportunity to change is not easy to determine, because very often there are things which publicly are talked about as reform objectives, which are never, ever going to happen. Right. And so you need to understand where there is the possibility from the policy side of genuine reform. Now, an important part of that tends to be the existence of champions inside government. So individuals who, for various reasons, become people who are both committed to reform and have staked their political identity or whatever on reform, but also committed to using evidence as part of that process. Not the only thing, but as part of the process in trying to promote reform. So identification of reform champions, or at least people who are open to reform, is hugely important in terms of whether research ends up landing, and even understanding what research we should be doing. So that's, I'm now sort of drifting into the sort of constraints and incentives on the policymaker side. So constraints are obviously a lack of information, don't know who might be doing research, who might be relevant, don't even know what kind of research might be relevant to the policy decisions they're trying to make. So what that means is we need to think of mechanisms, and I think in the Indian context, obviously there's lots of existing mechanisms, but we have to think of how we amplify and reinforce them for improving dialogue between policymakers and researchers, so that researchers, and that can be either direct or can be mediated by different kinds of intermediaries. And the idea basically is to bring policymakers into a discussion of the challenges, the policy challenges they face, and where research is both already shedding light on those issues, where it might shed light on those issues, and where it probably can't shed light on those issues, so that we get a better sense both of what we as researchers might want to be doing for them, just distilling existing knowledge, but then in particular also identifying new opportunities for research that will be genuinely useful in helping to unpack and make progress on a policy issue. And I think there's often a tendency to think about research as being most useful in telling policymakers or helping policymakers to understand what works and what doesn't. And there is an important role there, and wrapping evaluation around new policy initiatives, particularly if it's a staggered rollout and that sort of thing, can be very powerful. But research is also very powerful in helping policymakers to think differently about issues, to just reframe how they think, because that often opens up a whole new set of policy instruments that they never thought were relevant. And so I think one of the things we as researchers need to be very mindful of is that it's not just if something connects directly, like A to B, to a particular policy initiative, that it's useful. Even if what it's doing is helping us to get a deeper insight into some part of the context of the policy challenge, then it can be fundamentally influential in changing how people think about it. What do we learn? Okay, briefly, I'm sure I'm over my time. So let me just say very briefly about past experiences. I think a little bit banal maybe, but I think there's certain things that seem to be common across a different range of country, environments, however, and certain things that are just different case by case. So first thing to say is every environment is a little bit different, and so new relationships are really important to try to understand what priorities and ways of working and ways of interacting and so forth. So just to give you an example of our current engagements, we have one in Zambia, where the president, who came in August 2021, is very openly committed to reform and very openly wanting to engage with external researchers. And so he's given a very high profile. So we end up having someone embedded in State House, and he's given a very high profile to the research inputs that he wants as part of policy. He's pretty unusual. right? In most circumstances, you have partnerships at ministerial or DG level that are really what are going to draw things, and that just has to be determined on a country by country basis where the sort of points of entry are and what's going to be most effective and whatever. But I think to summarize some of the common points, I think we need to think about the interaction between researchers and policymakers not being about, here's my great findings, so I'll leave it to you to take into practice. It's about a much, much earlier conversation, which is, what are the challenges, you face, and, that we might be able to be helpful with. And let's have a conversation to see where we might be helpful. From that, flesh out an agenda and some priorities. And then it's always going to be down on us to identify the research questions, right? The policymaker's not going to be able to identify research, so we have to do that and go back and forth. And then once we've identified a policy question that really is going to make a difference, to then involve the policymakers as much as possible as the research proceeds. Because one of the other mistakes we make as researchers tends to be that only the findings are interesting. Actually, the baseline is almost always interesting to the policymaker, and things that come out as intermediate outputs or whatever are interesting. And, especially if you're, say, doing an evaluation, the policymaker is much more interested in learning how to do it better than learning that it was wrong ex post, right? Or learning it was fundamentally flawed ex post. So having design, a sort of research design that's going to facilitate that, and then encouraging the policymakers to do staged rollouts and those sorts of things, which make it easier for them to learn, I think is fundamental to success. And then the final thing I would say is time makes a difference. So the longer you build a relationship over more time, and obviously engaging, honestly and helpfully, then you develop a stronger relationship and all sorts of good stuff happens. They're more open with what the political context really is about. They're more likely to allow you access to data that's confidential. They're more likely to make time for you and other researchers and talk about that stuff. So investing in those relationships, once you identify who is critical, investing in those relationships really pays off in terms of both the effectiveness of the research, but also the sort of the bandwidth, the breadth of the engagement.
Great. Thank you very much, Jonathan. So, Som, perhaps we can turn to you to hear more about your view at ISI as a researcher, but also as someone who's worked very closely on policy issues in India.
Yeah, so I kind of agree with everything Jonathan said. I guess, one can think about policy engagement in two different ways. One is sort of the nitty-gritty kind of way. So let me give you an example. We're doing some research with the government of Kerala. There's an agency called the Energy Management Center, and their remit is to basically, find ways to save energy, right, and lower costs. So they are running a program in which in childcare centers all over the state, they're basically handing out electric stoves. And the idea is that basically the children in these daycare centers, the teachers and teachers' assistants cook a meal and prepare some meals, 3 meals actually, but 1 full meal. And they use gas for the cooking. And so that's a drain on the Kerala government's finances. And so they want to reduce those costs, and they think they can do that with electricity. And the timing is good because the meal is happening in the middle of the day, and that's when solar power is cheap and readily available. So now, so they're rolling this out. There are 33,000 of these daycare centers in Kerala. And so they asked us to, basically monitor this. And so we started collecting data. And one of the things that we found just by surveying the teachers in these, after they had handed out some of these stoves in some of these daycare centers, that it turned out that a lot of the teachers didn't use the stoves. They're just still lying there in their boxes on a shelf in the daycare centers. And so we asked them, well, why? And so there were a number of reasons, right? Something to do with the wiring, something to do with, whether the bill will be reimbursed and this and that. So all kinds of things which sort of vary in different places. And so we went back and we told them that, well, some of these are being used as you had hoped, but some of them are not, and these are some of the difficulties, and these are some of the things for you to watch out for. So, that's kind of useful because they can then hopefully do something, some course corrections, and make the program more effective. And then, of course, you can do some formal econometrics, and look at the impacts and so on. But it's a moving kind of thing. So as the rollout proceeds, because we've told them from early stages that here's how you can do it better, then one can go on as time passes and roll out. Hopefully things will get better and we'll see larger effects as we go further out. So that's kind of the, it's a sort of nitty-gritty kind of thing. And I think there we're sort of being helpful. We're being helpful because it's typically not, these government agencies, they typically don't spend too much time on monitoring and figuring out how effective something is. They say, okay, here's an idea, they do some informal kind of scoping and so on, and then they start rolling things out. And then they don't go and do systematic surveys, right? And if you don't talk to enough people, you won't pick up these problems. So at a very basic level, it's not something that you need a PhD to do. In fact, the agency could have done it itself. It's just that that's not where their incentives and their energy and their, thing is aligned. So it's sort of helpful for them to engage with academics who are in the habit of asking questions. So that's, I think, one level at which, and there are many such studies which many researchers are doing. Rohini Pandey gave a talk at the ISI a few months ago in which he described a program in Bihar where they, it's a similar kind of thing. They gave the government very useful information on how to improve a particular program. So that's one kind of policy engagement, and I think that's useful. But in some sense, I would say, I think personally, I find that not uninteresting, and it's useful, but it's not, There's the other kind, I think, which is that where you do research on issues which connect to policy. I mean, they have some relevance, but they're not directly relevant, right? I mean, you do, and you engage with policymakers, occasionally you talk about, they tell you what they're, whatever they're doing and what they're interested in. And you talk about, what kind of research that they might find interesting. And over time, one kind of builds up relationships with some people. And there it's different. It's not that, okay, I did this research project and I discovered this, and then you can use it like this. I mean, that happens sometimes, but I don't think that's where a lot of what's valuable from academia going into policymaking is. It's more that we have a sense of what the literature on this whole topic is about. It's not that I wrote this paper or whatever. It's we have a sense of what the literature says. We have a sense of what's been learned on this. And at some point, the policymakers ask you a question, and they want an answer yesterday. And the reason that you can be helpful at that point is because a lot of researchers have done a lot of research, and you have a sense of what, what's a useful answer to a question like that. And in order to be able to give a useful answer, you have to have been obviously an academic who's engaged in the academic pursuit and have a sense of the literature. But you also have to have a sense of how that knowledge can be translated into something that's useful for the policymaker at that juncture. And as Jonathan said, that's something that takes relationship building. There has to be a certain level of trust. The policymaker has to trust you and feel that you are going to give them an answer which is useful to them, and that you're not just basically trying to self-promote your particular whatever paper or steady or whatever it is. So I think those are well, I would say one more thing. In India, anyway, the government is, one of the things that's characteristic of people who are fairly high up at government levels, at the levels at which policy decisions are taken, often have too many responsibilities. So they tend to be overwhelmed by day-to-day things. There isn't enough time to sort of think and plan and so on. That's frequently the case in people in executive positions. And so you tend to be asked questions into the certain very short fuse, right? You can't go and then do research at that point to give them an answer. It just isn't enough time. So it has to be based on stuff that you've already done and other people have already done that you're aware. So.
Great. I think we will pivot slightly. So Robin, I'll have you come in at the end now. I think some you gave some great examples about exactly how this type of collaboration could work. And perhaps now the best thing is to continue on examples and case studies. So Michael, can I bring you in online to talk a bit more about EPIC and whatever else you'd like to bring into the conversation?
Sure. I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So look, Sam and Jonathan, it's a little hard to follow them. They covered a lot of what I think are the most important points. What I would add to this is it requires this, I think I'd like to tell this story because sadly I thought it was true. When I went to work in the Obama administration in 2009, I thought, oh my goodness, this is great. I've been training my whole life. I have all these ideas. And that's very exciting. And surely people will be throwing flowers in my path, roses, and they'd be very excited for my participation and my ideas. And what you realize, and I think this was a thread running through Sam and Jonathan's comments, is these guys have their own lives. They go to lunch with their own friends. They have a whole social network, and you're kind of an outsider. And at some level, you don't look very different than an advocate for anything else, an advocate for, advocate for evidence, an advocate for subsidies for corn. And so it's really critical to recognize that as the starting point. And as Jonathan was emphasizing, nobody really wants you to come in their office and tell you what they need to do. The key thing is to listen to what they want to do. And in listening to Sam's story, I was reminded when the Department of Energy in the United States was considering rolling out about a whole bunch of policies coming out of the Great Recession. One of them was the installation of smart meters. And smart meters, as many people in this room probably know, have this great feature that they can help run a more reliable grid. They can help consumers make more informed choices and things like that. And I said, oh, this is terrific. What are you planning to do for your evaluation to understand what all the benefits are? That might help you with future funding if you were able to articulate that. And they said, oh, that's great. You're interested in evaluation too. Well, we're interested in evaluation, and our evaluation is going to be the number of smart meters installed. And so they just have like a completely different perspective than we do. So I think it's really important to start from that recognition that we live in a very different world. We have a different set of incentives, and we're thinking about problems in a very different way. I think Tim wanted me to talk a little bit about some of when this has worked well. And I think maybe the most recent example where this has worked well in my own experiences has been, it's a little bit embarrassing to talk about, but I left the Obama administration in 2010, kind of feeling a little defeated that we had failed to pass carbon pricing, and we had kind of failed to use markets to address pollution. And so one of the very first things I did is I went to try to restart my work in India. One thing led to another and ended up at the Minister of Environment and Forest office. And he was feeling around for new ideas. And I said, oh, well, you should do pollution pricing. And he goes, that's a great idea. We should do that. And then that kind of set off on a path, which is now, I think, 14 or 15 years long, that ultimately led to 5 or 6 years ago launching a pilot for pollution pricing in the state of Gujarat. I think Anant is in the room, and he has been a partner in crime at every step. And that pilot we ran as an RCT, and it proved very successful. And it has taken the fancy of the Gujarati policymakers and the policymakers in other states. And as one thing has led to another, and it's now kind of led to increasing adoption, and we hope for much wider adoption than has happened already on pollution. And that all kind of started from trying to be responsive to what the policymakers were interested in. And then years of kind of, I don't know if Anant would describe it this way, but somewhat mind-numbing Tuesday morning phone calls and daily activities in India, trying to sort out the many, many steps from that high-level idea to turning something into a reality. And another thing that I think has been very important in that has been to have continued presence on the ground. That is one version of that. Part of that has been co-generation, which people have talked about, that is having people sit with the policymakers on a daily basis. But another part has been to kind of have the institutions that IGC has set up, JPAL has set up, and EPIC India, which Anant was the initial director of, that provide a sense of and a reality of really being on the ground and participating in deep, meaningful ways, and are able to engage not just on the thing that might end up in a journal, but in a series of, like, let's call them adjacent issues that the policymakers are interested in, and all of which are trying to take very serious what their goals are, and deeply embed oneself in the context, rather than in the intermediate micro textbook where one looks at pollution markets and sees that they must be a good idea. So why don't I pause there?
Great, thank you, Michael. Let's turn to Shweta to talk about, springing this on you, to talk more about
It's relaxing.
BRAC India's work and all that.
Okay. Yeah, so we're sort of, BRAC in Bangladesh is this very large entity. They do everything from, BRAC Bank to, BRAC schools, BRAC healthcare. In India, we're very small, and our leverage is working with others. So working with government, working with other NGO partners to scale programs. So a lot of this, translating insight to action is something that we have to actively engage in. But I was just sort of thinking about, okay, what are the top 3 development policy ideas in India in the last 20 years that have actually hit scale? So more than 6-7 states, more than, I don't know, at least 1/4 of the population. And maybe, I'll get more ideas in the room, but what I thought about was, the NREGA scheme was one. The National Rural Livelihood Mission is another successful one. Maybe the whole digitization, Aadhaar was, another one. So what were the starting points of these policy ideas? Was it research, or was it practice? Or how did they actually get from, one SHG by Marada in Karnataka to now, hundreds of thousands of millions? And I think the answer there is quite complicated. It's not just, oh, we did brilliant evaluations, the World Bank did brilliant evaluations. I think a lot of what Jonathan was saying, champions that stayed in their positions for a long time, that could influence more fiscal resources. That really supported, the scaling of these things. And I think that there was value that was seen by the political layer. So oftentimes there's the incentives of the political layer and the bureaucratic layer are actually not in sync. They're different incentives. And so the magic happens when these two kind of come together somehow. And that's what we are also trying to, get at.
Great, great. Last but not least, Bob, we'd love to hear from you.
No, I have to stop relaxing. So, let me just say some comments based on what people have said before. One of some of the things that Som said about Michael said about people. There is to actually have this bridge between research and policy be super effective. In the end, you have to be operating, all of us probably know how to operate at a high level. But what you really need to be operating on is where the work actually happens. And this comes in two avatars in India, I think. One is actually individuals, right? So there are obviously, it helps for there to be a top-down blessing. But what you need is to actually have institutional presence that's consistent, that's working with people on the ground. Someone spoke earlier about a data effort with Niti Aayog. And here's the second aspect of being ground level. That is, in India, things happen very often at the state level that are really very powerful. Niti Aayog, it's wonderful, of course. But we've, I think, and I'm wearing two hats here, but one is the EPIC hat and one is the Ahmedabad University hat that I'll speak about in a second. But in EPIC, by way of example, some of the work we've done in the state of Odisha, we've been invited by the government to form what they call a data policy and institutes innovation centers, a bunch of words. But what it is the Odisha government proactively saying, come work with us with all the data we've got to figure out what are the right questions to ask, and then we'll think about how we answer them. That's, of course, Odisha government has been, in spite of being economically not so strong, has been incredibly proactive in many of the things that it does. And I think those things don't happen instantaneously. They are the result of years of work, of working with that entity to get something like this to happen. But I think it's a very satisfying beginning, if nothing else. I'd say, speaking about institutional presence, Michael spoke a little bit about EPIC India. What I have noticed since I've come back to India is that there's amazing research happening all over India, both in the economic space and the policy space, etc. But a lot of the noise and the projection in the press and general literature is often from think tanks who are not actually at universities, which is not super strongly evidence-based. And so I've been speaking to a bunch of institutions about thinking about, we do need in India a genuinely domestic institutional, or not one, many organizations or institutions that are dealing with the issues around broadly, climate change, sustainability, energy and environment, etc. And, I work at Ahmedabad University as part of the things that I do. And we are probably going to announce later in the summer, we are setting up a climate institute at Ahmedabad University. It's meant to think deeply about what is it to be a multidisciplinary institution that thinks about, education, research, and a way of impacting people both through, education means so many different things. It could mean educating at grassroots to students doing internships at villages, making things happen, or it could be executive education for for people in government and in corporations, or it could be degree programs. So we're thinking very seriously about this, and we're working obviously closely with my other Epic hat and with Anant at Warwick, etc. So we're very excited about this, both as a way of actually, I think something that Robin said yesterday, there's so many young people who are wanting to engage, and what are the avenues, what are the serious avenues by which they can engage? I hope that an institutional receiving part for them in India would be a useful way for young people to, whether it's degrees or whether it's doing projects, a constructive way to engage.
You know, can I just join in here and add to what Bala is saying? And he and I have been working on this quite a bit, but I think one thing is to find a way to, I'm not an expert on the Indian educational system, but there's a traditional emphasis on engineering. And I think the engineering approach to some of these social problems isn't always the right frame. That it can lead to, let's install the smart meters, or let's install SOM's energy efficiency machines, whatever those were, I didn't quite get. And in a kind of very mechanical way. Did I get that right, Som? They're energy efficiency machines in a box or something. And I think one thing that Bala and I hope to do is help to launch kind of a approach to thinking about in the domain of climate and energy, the problem with a kind of more holistic and more using economics and more thinking of trade-offs way that, you know, it's not that can't be gotten in India, but I think it's especially important as we all kind of confront this global energy challenge. So I just want to add that. Maybe, Bala, you wanted to pick up on any of that.
Yeah, I'm sorry to make this a fireside chat with me and Michael, but you know, it is true. And Michael
Fireside over the internet.
Over the internet, of course, it's the best firesides are there. You know, the UK has got its own education system. The US, you know, the so-called liberal education allows you to spend a couple of years studying a few different things before deciding what to do. And in India, all our traditional universities, you do declare what you do in the beginning, but there are a set of, you know, newly born, more liberal universities that have their own pluses and minuses, but that are, one of the pluses have the ability for people to take many classes. And so we do think, Michael and I think about this from a Chicago perspective, what is that general serious climate curriculum that you should have, which before you decide what you want to do in college, before you decide whether you want to be an engineer or a policy guy or an economist, what do you need to find out before you decide where your interest is? And I think that's an interesting question that people have to answer as education becomes more serious in this area as an area of specialization. B, it's not something that somebody in the US or somebody in the UK can even think about without seriously thinking about India and China and what they have to say about that. So in some sense, you know, there's a mutual feedback mechanism. If there is a concept of climate education happening in India, that's super important to somebody in Chicago thinking about what's climate education. And by means of this network, and you know, obviously Michael and I are from the same origins, or from Chicago origins, so it's easy to work on this together in Ahmedabad. But we're also working on it together between us and Tsinghua, and eventually between Tsinghua and Ahmedabad, and create a really rich curriculum of that's not even just ideas, but also involves the people from I mean, they have you know, my utopian vision is like they have these global programs for MBAs, you know, where people go all over the world and study what it means to be an MBA, which, you know, don't ask me, but that's what they do. It'd be actually much more useful if they went all over the world and studied what it means to understand what climate change is and what can do economically, what technological solutions are that can work in India because you can talk about like expensive things, but no one's going to make them in India. So at Ahmedabad University, for instance, we have somebody who makes, who spends all his time on, drone mounted, low cost, air quality sensors. And the city of Ahmedabad as stationary centers, sensors has only a handful. And so when you get information, you get it from like 4 places in Ahmedabad. Whereas this drone went around and did this right, you could actually get the meaning of air quality in Ahmedabad correctly. I feel like, that work is super important or will be super important in Africa as it begins to understand what's possible for them to do, etc. So I think there's a really exciting educational thing that we're all working on. We are working on, my colleague Meenal and I, Meenal's from Ahmedabad University as well, are working on it as well. And it's going to be super exciting over the next year or 2.
Yeah, these are a lot of great ideas, and it's really fascinating to hear these initiatives. So perhaps the hardest question I've reserved for Robin, maybe, which is how can we really move the needle? So what has to be different compared to what's been done before on India by researchers, by other universities, to really achieve, as Shweta was saying, kind of impact or idea at that scale? I think maybe the conversation has already touched on some of these new approaches, but it'd be interesting to hear your overall thoughts on how we should approach this going forward as well.
Okay, so I've got a bunch of scribbles here. I think there's kind of 3 things in my mind. The first is, it's clear there's a kind of common purpose in this area. And that's the sort of first necessary thing to do something big, right? You need a lot of people who are interested. And obviously we have like Stefan Halliget for the World Bank here. We've got a bunch of philanthropists. We've got researchers, young and old. And I think that common interest is the first necessary condition to kind of supercharge things, because without it, we're not feeling the excitement. And I think one powerful thing that Esther said yesterday when we were talking about whatever it is, research into policy, is that don't worry as long as you're excited, more or less is what she said. I.e., don't worry whether you're going to have immediate policy impact, because if you're excited and you're enjoying writing your paper as a PhD student or whatever, then that's good. So I think that's one thing. That common purpose thing really is coming out of the fact that this environmental climate change thing is the big thing out there right now, and will remain for at least a century from now. And so I think that is really, really important. So one thing that I keep thinking about is what are the different things that have to come together. Obviously, a lot of money has to come together, and a lot of idea generating places, which increasingly I think have to be in the places where the damage is the greatest. So that's the big countries like India, China, Brazil, Indonesia, etc. So that's great that activity is happening. But there's also nothing wrong with just being excited about your paper, because who knows whether it's going to be useful or not. The fact you're excited and it's working in an area that's clearly important, it kind of builds up gradually. So I guess that was the sort of first thing, and that's what I keep referring to in a rather cringing way as the movement. And I remember being at the World Bank recently with Stefan, and I could sort of feel that the only World Banker people, people from San Diego and so on, and there was definitely a sense of that the movement is in the World Bank, it's in the IMF, it's gradually growing, but people really have a big common interest. They feel a common purpose. Obviously, we've been working for BRAC for years. BRAC's pivoted. So I think that's the one. I would say that's the thing that really is feeling that common purpose and doing everything you can to kind of make ideas not just arise, but also to kind of get into practice. We don't really know how to sort this out. I mean, it's the truth. And that's why I'm super excited that we, in this area, places like India just cannot be avoided. It's just, just stuff has to be done there. So if we can sort of supercharge research and policy there with ISI and others, that's great. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing, which I think is also, which Jonathan was sort of alluding to, is you've got to have a lot of humility. I mean, if you go into policymaking circles without humility, then you're going to get a lot of pushback because, people are busy, they've got other stuff to do, they may have no interest in what you're saying. So remaining somewhat humble, sort of focused on what you know and not saying you have to do anything, but here's some stuff, or maybe that can maybe be useful, here's what the data looks like. And I think that combined with a kind of long-term iterative process, much like Som was describing, that, you know, you kind of just keep providing bits and pieces of stuff, partly from what's just in your brain, is very, very useful. But for that to happen, you have to have institutional structures. You have to have places in the countries where you're working. You have to learn across countries. And I increasingly think you just have to have more and more people working, particularly younger people, in this area, because it's just an area where the need for knowledge and the amount of knowledge is kind of completely, you know, the gap is yawning. So I think in that sort of iterative process, I mean, the kind of stuff that we built with BRAC is a good example. 2006, didn't want to do any RCTs, did an RCT, but kind of got some good results, used that to get funding, do the same program other places, change the program. That's the kind of, I mean, that's I don't know, that's more than 10 years, almost 20 years. So just assume that it's a good thing to have those relationships for very long periods, because that's kind of where you get, and you work on different stuff as you have the relationship. So whatever, you know, if you're starting out as a PhD student, be thinking about, you know, okay, you got to get your PhD, you got to get a job, work on what you're excited about. But one advantage of kind of working with policymakers is often you end up with some path dependency, and that is actually good for the research, the quality of the research, and the degree to which it actually feeds into policy. So that's the sort of middle bit, which is kind of humility, long-term, iterative. And then the final thing, which I think is kind of loops back to the first point of common purpose, and this isn't like an existential issue. I mean, your lecture made that pretty clear. And I think that helps. It makes us feel like we do whatever it takes to produce the research, to get the research into policy. And I think the manner in which that happens, we're still experimenting. You were talking sort of about experimentation. You know, me and Michael work on a bunch of different things. Some of them are quite closed shop, some of them are quite open, some are very policy oriented and not. And I think we just need to keep trying all these different channels to see what works, because I don't think we know. It's not going to be one thing, but I think just the level of interest I've felt in the last 5 years of the LSE in the environmental area, just from this one institution, has been astonishing, which is, you know, what produced this. So just kind of follow your node, what's most exciting to work on. But I think the more, my own experience anyway, the more I interact with other people in this space, the more I kind of do understand what's going on. So having as many meetings, visiting countries, figuring stuff out is really, really important to actually sort of get real sense of what research is needed and what might actually be of interest. Because one thing Som said right at the beginning of his lecture, which really struck me, is that you typically begin with this idea, what, you know, what's important in Zambia, who knows? And then you have this idea in your head. And what Som said is, you know, we all think of climate change. You go to India and you visit the ministry, they don't say climate change. They're saying stuff like growth, they're saying like youth unemployment, all the stuff that's coming down the track right now in the next year. And so how do you balance those sort of immediate needs with this obviously existential problem, climate change, environmental degradation? It's going to be very tricky. And I think it's one where, in my own experience, it's much better to be humble and say we don't know what we're doing, rather than saying I've got the answer. We do a bunch of public lectures telling you about the answer. I think that method of working is wrong, particularly if there's not, you know, clear evidence to back it up. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. I think we have time for one round of questions. So I'm happy to collect any questions, comments, or anything that people have thought of throughout the conversation. Yeah. I think Sam has a question.
I just want to thank the panel. Really, really useful advice and a comment and observation towards the point made by Jonathan. I just wanted to say that I totally agree that it's often a process and building trust over time. And a lot of cases, the policymaker tends to care more about the process of getting to the result than the actual result cooked up in a lab somewhere and then just presented to them. And that process matters, and it needs to be localized, and it needs to happen over a period of time. And I think the IGC model is brilliant in that it works with local researchers and the government and gets the policymakers involved early on, as well as the local researchers. And it enables for real impact. But I would also say that part of the issue is that the IGC model is unique in that you don't see it in a lot of places, and partly because there is not a lot of incentive for academics, particularly PhD students or recently graduated PhDs, to engage in that type of work because the institutional arrangements are not in universities, not in a way where it would incentivize that. So it's good to encourage people to do that, but how do we also think about changing some of these metrics of success within universities to be able to do that? And this, I guess, goes to the entire panel, not just Jonathan. But yeah, thank you for all your insights.
Yes. Thank you so much for the great discussion. I have a question about this idea of adaptive experimentation. So traditionally in academia, RCTs, they have to go through pre-trial protocol and be fixed so that researchers have limited degrees of freedom. But recently some very big scale trials like community health workers in Zambia, they're having these adaptive experiments where researchers think the stakes are too great for the RCT to have an existing model and not work perfectly. I was just wondering about your experience of when you work with policymakers, do they also take seriously this idea that some experiments, they have really huge stakes that, even at the expense of changing the format and organization halfway, we have to find a new model of getting it work and what the possible implications for the quality of the findings and the integrity would be.
Great, Stefan. You can hand him the microphone. That'll be great.
Thank you. Actually, I had a question because I think a lot of what you described work for the interaction between policy and economics, but what about the specificities of climate change and sustainability? And especially the fact that it's a domain that is extremely sensitive with a break between high-income countries and a lot of low-income countries who feels like they are being told what to do and that high-income countries are not doing enough. And I think it makes the dialogue much more complicated, and it makes it even more important to separate the goals from how we achieve the goals and to be able to work about the how you achieve the goals without really necessarily saying about whether the goals are the right one or the wrong one. And so I was just curious in your experience how you managed the specificity of the global nature of the climate change challenge, and maybe on that, one thing that I think the community is not doing enough is to look at the policies that maybe we don't like, and how to do them as well as possible. So don't quote me on this one, but I think if the economic community has spent more time to think about how to do the IRA well, probably the IRA would be better designed than what it is, but we have spent a lot of time looking at a pricing approach which never so far got traction in the US. So it's just an example, but working on things which might not be as attractive, but might get implemented and better be implemented well is also something that I see as really super important. Thank you.
Great, so we'll have to put a lid on questions. I think we have a set of questions on, let's broadly say, kind of research incentives for young researchers, which Sam was raising, kind of how we can think about that. Second question on adaptive experimentation, if I can sum that up in a few words. And then when we think about climate change, what does the global nature of it mean specifically for how we should think about our engagement via research and policy? And then in particular, when we do research on policies, how should we think about researching policies which are not going to be first best in our minds, but may be politically more attractive? In the interest of time, I will just open it to anyone who wants to jump in. perhaps easiest for you, Michael, online, if you want to just come in quickly, and then we can carry on here in person.
Yeah, so I think there's an important question here that maybe is a thread through some of these questions is, I don't think the role for academics is to pretend to be policymakers. I think our role is to try and discover the world, how the world works as best we can, and produce that information. And of course, as we've been talking about, juice it so that it becomes useful in the world. And so there is a tension between being non-responsive to the policymakers, but also, I think, true to trying to understand the world as best we can. And so, you know, we're not going to change universities, I don't think, so that universities take the policy impacts of research as their primary goal, because I don't think that's universities' mission. I think their mission is to create knowledge and discussion and better understanding. Yeah, it's, you know, to the last question, it's probably good to understand first best and second best policies. But I think actually embedded in the question is something that I would disagree with. I don't think that the world has a climate crisis. That's something that we're putting on policymakers in a somewhat strange way, I think. Policymakers, what they're trying to do and what societies are trying to do is, I think, to lead to better energy choices. And those better energy choices really are a balancing of three goals, where climate is one, but another is access to inexpensive and reliable energy, which is so critical for unlocking growth and living standards, and trying to make sure we have air that people can breathe that doesn't cause them to lead shorter and sicker lives. And so a unitary focus on climate, I think, in some sense misses the picture as it is, and also I think in some way can lead to these misunderstandings or failure to connect with where societies are and where policymakers are.
Good.
Yeah, I think it may be helpful to unpack this category of policymaker. I mean, who are we actually talking about? And in India, it's very complex. There's, you know, is it the parliamentarian that you want to influence at the national level? Is it the state legislative assembly, various layers of bureaucracy? I mean, the Secretary Rural Development is not going to engage with you on how robust an RCT is vis-a-vis another method. He just doesn't, she doesn't have the time. As you were saying, the attention span is very, very small. The person who's writing the document for the secretary maybe gives you 15 more minutes, but even that. So I think, you know, this blanket sort of term of policy maker may not be that helpful if you really want to engage and understand how to make things, translate sort of ideas from action or research to, you know, practical implementation ideas. So yeah, that was my broad point.
Sorry, I realized I was fast tracking the coffee break. We have until 4:30, so we actually have enough time. So please.
But let me say something and continuing our fireside chat. You know, this, especially in India, the practical reality about this tension between wanting to grow and having a clean environment is very real, very immediate, right? If you look at just go politically and in terms of what influences what people want to clamor about and what influences voting really at very state levels, right? There is, if you go to cities in India, people are having real problems with you know, pollution and wanting to have clean. Right now, Bangalore is having a serious water problem, so people want to have clean water and clean air, and then, you know, from both a countrywide level as well as significant corporate interest, nobody wants to stop growing. So if your solution or your you know, a research or policy approach somehow says that's all very well, here's a great answer, that's no one's going to No one's going to buy that. And if no one's going to buy that, you aren't going to get time from any policy maker sitting in these ministries, listening carefully and doing what you say.
Maybe just one point. So picking up on some of your initial question, but also Michael's comment. I guess I would be a little bit less pessimistic, Michael, than you in terms of, I don't disagree at all with what we as academics should seek to do, but I am more optimistic, I think, than you about the overlap between that and what's useful for policy and the potential to increase that overlap. So I think we can, in various ways, and one of the things, of course, IGC seeks to do, identify issues which are of high relevance and interest to policy and can produce very high quality academic work. So, IGC produces a lot of very high quality academic publications, but at the same time has a lot of high policy impact. So, it is, I think we can, through being proactive in different ways and building, and supporting institutions and so forth, we can enlarge that space where, research that, is genuinely going to help us improve our understanding of the world is also going to be improving policy. So I think that probably, I guess, would be my bigger point. The smaller point is a lot of universities do care about impact now. And so in tenure decisions and so forth, it's something that does come into to discussion. So that I think that also is helping to change a bit, the incentives for young researchers.
I'll just continue on that in response to Sam's initial question as well. I think there's a lot of returns in academia as well from showing things at scale. And I think by design, almost policy change is often at scale. And so, maybe you don't get the credit for moving the needle on the policy front, but I think a lot of, or some of the very most exciting papers in academia tend to have that component there as well, whether that's the central focus or not. And I think a lot of that can still then align with the early career paths for researchers to think about, maybe it's not national level policy that you'll be changing, but certainly you'll be working on questions and you'll be encouraged to work on questions that fundamentally have meaning at scale. And I think, especially in this space on environment and climate. And so I think that could in some way address a little bit of that tension. So, Robin, any further thoughts?
Well, I guess I could say that if you're a PhD student, you're starting out, and you're asking the question, well, why should I worry about this policy stuff? I have to get my thesis done, and I have to get my papers published, and and the referees are not going to be concerned with these kinds of things. And I think that's true. I think that is true, and you should realize that is true. At the same time, I think if you're ambitious, then it is the case that the most important decisions you make when you're doing your PhD, when you're starting out in research, is to select an interesting problem. You can use great methods and get great data and so on. But if the question you're asking is not that interesting, then you are not going to have that much of an impact. And well, there are two ways of asking interesting questions. One is, well, what's going on? That's the way that nearly everybody actually finds them is, okay, what's the latest paper in the AER on this, right? And then let me do something to follow that. And I think that's important. I mean, one has to speak to the literature. One has to speak to the questions which researchers are asking, and they're usually interesting questions. But there's also the larger world out there. And in the larger world out there, one of the ways you find interesting questions is by figuring out what society at large and policymakers in particular are interested in, and what are those kinds of questions. And I think I think having some kind of dialogue, internal dialogue in your head between these two sources of ideas is and can be very productive for you. So that's the sense in which paying attention to the policy debates is something which can be of practical value to you as a young researcher.
I mean, just on Stefan's question, which I think is super important, that, you know, the issue of poverty, which was kind of what motivated a lot of earlier development research, was in many ways a simpler problem because you had poor populations based somewhere and you had domestic policies to confront that. And I think the global bit of this problem, you consume energy in London, it affects, is problematic in a kind of moral, ethical sense, but also problematic because obviously policy is within political jurisdiction, and you know, affecting policy in other jurisdictions is difficult. So that's the sort of, that's the problematic side of it, and a lot of what is being discussed now is sort of how do we design institutions to deal with that problem in an international sense, which I think is ongoing and certainly very imperfect at the moment. On the more plus side, the problems that have been thrown up in the environmental area are interesting to a much larger set of fields in economics. So, you know, so you're seeing a lot more economists coming into this area from different fields because you need macro, you need IO, you need public, you need, and I think one way to sort of, on your sort of more political point, one way to square that circle is to say, you know, I always use the word innovation because it's palatable. You know, you need innovations to deal, either to produce substitutes for carbon stuff or to continue to produce growth with less carbon and so forth, with less pollution. And I think that the other thing is that the set of things within the environment, the damages and so on, and pollution, warming, and so forth, degradation of forests and oceans and so on, requires all sorts of different types of approaches, which are much, much richer than when we were just looking at a narrow thing. But on the other hand, the biggest problem is it's all about humans, and it's ultimately all about human welfare. So it's really kind of back to square one, but with a much wider range of challenges. And one of the things that's definitely happened is when you go back, there are environmental concerns with the non-human bit of things. So they were, you know, with wildlife and national parks and so on. So I think now that it's really about humans and the natural environment, you know, it's just, you're going to need a lot of innovative stuff if you're going to achieve some sort of balance. And then we really don't know how to do that. So it's kind of, but I think it's really, really valuable, which I think was Michael was pointing to keep the focus on human welfare, because that's obviously what people are voting in governments to do, is to improve human welfare, not to improve just the natural environment. So it's that two sides of the coin, and having those two things sort of, you know, achieve a better balance, and to have growth be, you know, that we can envisage prosperity continuing. And that gives hope, which is good in terms of encouraging innovation. Oh, sorry, just a minor point on the adaptive experimentation. So that's something that's coming up a lot, because in many cases, for example, with BRAC in Bangladesh, we're trying to figure out what are the new businesses that are, and we don't know. So people are in the field, you know, interviewing people and taking voice recordings, and then you throw that into AI, and that starts to pull out what are the most frequent new businesses that have come up in terms of, you know, that are going to work with salinity or whatever that. And I think in the future, what will happen is you may even begin to adjust your surveys as you go through the RCT, because, you know, typically what you do is you have hundreds and hundreds of questions, only a small number are used, because you're not learning what we know what. So I think that's coming up. That obviously runs foul of the whatever it's called, pre-specification of your experiment. But I think the AI thing is allowing you to learn as you do the survey what are the most important things to be asking, and what are going to be most interesting for the paper, or perhaps even what the people who you're working with want to know. So I guess I don't have a kind of clear answer. All I'm saying is it's just become much more feasible to do that because of AI.
If I could just jump in, I think, you know, one thing I want to emphasize, since I believe there's a lot of grad students there, is, and this is just kind of combining a couple points that people have made, is one, there's incredible opportunity to find in my view, research topics that are at the intersection of important for policy and expanding the frontier of knowledge. And I don't think you should feel demoralized that you have to just choose one and, you know, sabotage your academic career if it's all policy or be unrelated to policy. There's almost a like empty playing field there. And if you just put your mind to it, and as Sam was emphasizing, that means remaining connected to the outside world so you can see those questions. There's lots of opportunity there. So will universities in their tenure decisions care about whether or not it's implemented as policy? Maybe Jonathan, I don't completely agree on that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't questions of great academic value that are also deeply insightful about that. Then the second thing, which I think people have been emphasizing, I really believe deeply, is for graduate students in particular, researchers in general, not just graduate students, is if you don't like the process and you don't like the craftsmanship of putting together a paper and all the pieces that go into it, it's going to be really hard and kind of super unpleasant, I think. Dealing with referees who inevitably don't understand the brilliance of your ideas, almost certainly due to their own failings, but that's 100% true, that it happens all the time. And so I would just encourage everyone to like embrace the process and embrace the craftsmanship. You know, it's just, you'll write better papers, and I think you'll have a, you know, happier existence as a researcher. But the referees are always wrong, that's for sure.
So we had a question online relating to effectively the political economy of policymaking, both centrally and subnationally, say at the state level, and how that can interfere in the process of research, either in terms of the questions that are asked or in the process of trying to, say, design evaluations or designing research more generally to get actual answers for said policy questions. How should we think about, yeah, this political jungle in the research process? It's a question.
We look at the guy from Delhi.
I mean, I don't have any great insight into this. Obviously, I guess if you want to be policy relevant, you have to address the questions that policymakers are interested in. There's no use, you know, you may have your own questions, and perhaps they're much more interesting questions than what the policymaker is interested in. And if you believe that, then you should ignore the policymaker and go ahead and do the research on the questions that you think are the most important. But then don't have the illusion that, you know, policymakers are going to pay a lot of attention or that they're going to be convinced. Yeah. So I mean, you know, politics is supreme, right? I mean, you know, governments are elected by people, you know, with all their flaws, and they are the ones who have, I think, the legitimacy to take policy decisions and decide what's important and what isn't. As academics, we don't have that legitimacy when it comes to policy questions. We are entitled to have our own opinions as citizens, but you know, there may not be much of an overlap between what you think is important and what the policymakers thinks is important. And so, yeah, if you don't like the policymakers' politics, then you're probably in the wrong place.
I would just add that the tension between the national and the state level in India can actually be quite a productive tension, and one that we shouldn't want to eliminate. It's there for a reason. And I think you have to incorporate both interests, and you have to incorporate, the concerns of both parties, and they're both important. So weigh them equally and, respect the tension.
And I think that's very good advice. I also think, taking off a little bit what you said earlier about, how do these things start and become things of scale? Just to add to the example we spoke about before about the work we've done in Gujarat, etc., with pollution markets. The center isn't thinking about a pollution market. The center is thinking about a carbon market. Gujarat did a pollution market pilot, and then a pollution market actual thing in Surat, and now Gujarat is thinking of doing it in 5 more cities. We are now speaking to the government in Maharashtra. We said, how about this great pollution market we have in Gujarat? And they say, well, how about a socks market? So now we will do the socks market in Maharashtra. It's not a bad thing or a good thing. Center doesn't care about socks or pollution right now, the way looking at markets. But I do think that, if we didn't have this track record of actually grinding through 10 years of what it took to get a pollution market going in Gujarat, A, we couldn't speak about the thing so convincingly to Maharashtra, and B, we wouldn't have the guts to embark upon it and imagine what it would take to get from, fiddling around with the Pollution Control Board and the Environment Ministry and the Law Ministry and really working with all of these people who all want to do their thing, but obviously pulling in slightly different directions. But there's real value to the country. And maybe if you imagine 5 years down, you have a thriving PM 2.5 market in Gujarat and a thriving market for socks in Maharashtra, other states will pay attention to this. It doesn't mean that the center will suddenly pay attention to it. The center is focused on something else. I think the word that the phrase that Som used, politics is supreme. So you can't wonder what to do with it. You don't do anything with it. Just embrace it. It is what it is. And then you have to work to make sure you have a path to getting to scale.
Wonderful. I think we should all take time to thank the panel. I think this was a very interesting and insightful conversation on how we can catalyze this research and take that into policy. And in many ways, as we've discussed this afternoon, this marks the beginning of what we hope is a much wider push, at least from the LSE, IGC, ISI end on research in India. And I should announce that I'm hopefully right in announcing that there's a drinks reception. Yes, there is a drinks reception. That is immediately after this. And then there is, of course, the evening lecture this evening. So please join us in the old theater then. And tomorrow, I've circulated somewhat randomly programs for tomorrow's research session. Please do join us if you're interested. I'm hoping it's raining tomorrow, so you'll have nowhere else to be.
It's not raining tomorrow.
But let's have a round of applause and thank you, Michael, also for joining virtually.